Cultivating self-compassion, working with failure and self-criticism. In the last lesson, I shared with you the challenge of uncertainty and resulting anxiety that show up in our life and a prototyping mindset that we can adopt to work with these challenges. When stepping out of our comfort zone into uncertainty by treating unexpected or failed result of an experiment simply as information rather than utter devastating failure, we can work with such uncertainty with openness and kindness, which is a first step towards self-compassion. Sometimes failure still hurts, and some of us have a habit of beating ourselves up for our failures, which can make the experiences even harder. In this lesson, we'll be focusing on how to further nurture self-compassion so that when challenges hit and things don't go as we hope, we can still move forward with compassion for ourselves and others, but especially for ourselves. So let's begin with an activity. How would you respond? For this, I invite you to get a pen to write with and a paper to write on. So imagine yourself in a situation in which you were disappointed in yourself. For instance, because you made a mistake or failed to reach an important goal or because you messed something up. Please write down what you typically do, what you say, and note the tone in which you talk to yourself. How does it make you feel? You can pause the video at this point until you finish responding to the prompt. Now, think about a time when a close friend feels really bad about him or herself or is really struggling in some way. How would you respond to your friend in this situation, especially when you're at your best? Please write down what you typically do, what you say, and note the tone in which you typically talk to your friends. You can pause the video again to respond to the prompt. Did you notice a difference? If so, why? What factors or fears come into play that lead you to treat yourself and others so differently? Oftentimes, when I do this exercise with my students, I notice that they're very hard on themselves, but not so with their friends. In fact, they're very kind and forgiving to their friends. Usually, my students are quite surprised when they recognize this difference, but they say that when they make mistakes, they feel that they need to punish themselves in order to learn the lesson or to keep working hard to achieve high standards that they set for themselves. Whereas with their friends, they can't enforce their personal standards on them, so they respond in a kinder manner to them that is more forgiving. So, what factors lead you to treat yourself and others differently in times of challenges? So to backtrack a bit, you may have noticed that the following are ways many of us speak to ourselves in times of failure. Our words are accusatory, reproachful, and attacking. Our tone is hard, angry, or disappointed. And we have overwhelming feelings of failure, shame, guilt, inferiority, and fear. These words, tones, and feelings represent the inner critic within us. The inner critic within us says things like, "What's wrong with me? How could I let this happen? Why me? There is nothing I can do right. If I continue like this, I will inevitably fail." Or "I'm so stupid." Does any of these sound familiar to you? The inner critic, by definition, is an internal voice that commands and sends negative messages. And there are three main types of inner critic that tend to show up quite often. First, the imperative "you should." As I mentioned in my earlier video, Thoughts Cultivating Self-Empathy as well, our shoulds and shouldn'ts come from high expectations from ourselves, society, family, and other places. For example, they show up as, "I should be more like my brother," or "I should be getting a better grade." Then there are disapproving thoughts, feelings, and behavior. Failure and fallibility are met with self-judgment, and we judge ourselves for the inner reactions and behavior reactions to our failure experiences. So for example, the inner critic might say, "I shouldn't feel this way, I'm weak," or "Why did I say that? I'm so stupid." Then there are negative predictions like, "If I keep doing what I'm doing, then I will fail," or "I will never be loved." A possible cause to hard self-criticism is attributed to the way we may be raised as children. If your parents were highly critical of you, then you might find yourself speaking to yourself the way your parents spoke to you. Now, this really rang true to me. As much as I love my mom, I was brought up by a mom who was very hard on me, both my character and my actions when growing up. And I've learned to speak to myself in a similar way whenever I made mistakes. Still to this day, I find myself being very critical of myself. So to find out more acutely how we typically treat ourselves in difficult times, check out the activity self-compassion scale in the activities page. You can download a worksheet that allows you to rate yourself on various different criteria to find out how critical you are of yourself when you face challenges. So now that we have explored the idea of an inner critic and our tendency to be self-critical in times of challenges, let's now shift gear and discuss about an alternative way of responding to challenges, which is to respond with compassion. But what is compassion really? Let's think of a situation when you're walking down the street and see a person begging. What is a compassionate way to act towards them? Have a think about this before moving on to the next section. To describe what compassion is, it might help to clarify first what compassion is not. Compassion is not co-suffering, which is a person is having a hard time and you suffer for the pain that the person is having. Now, just because you feel pain together, it doesn't make it a compassionate act. Compassion is also not sympathy. This is victimizing and pitying someone with a thought of poor you. This kind of attitude equates to looking down on the person and not really connecting with this person. It's not compassion. Now, compassion involves first an acknowledgement of pain that someone is having a hard time. And it's not only the acknowledgement, but it involves a deep understanding of the pain and suffering without being consumed by their pain. And it also involves acceptance of the person who suffers and not judging them to be faulty or weak. Now, all of these aspects thus far are also about empathy because they're about connecting with the person and meeting the person exactly where they're at. And lastly, it involves having a wish for the person that their suffering may decrease. This wish to lessen suffering is what takes compassion a step further from empathy. So what we described is a definition of compassion that we extend to others, and self-compassion is simply this compassion directed inward, relating to ourselves as the object of care and concern when faced with the experience of suffering. To understand self-compassion a little more, I want to give an analogy. Let's say that you're trying to put a picture up on the wall and you accidentally hit your fingers with a hammer. You are bleeding and are in a lot of pain. What would you do? You would go and find a band-aid to cover up the wound and wish for yourself that you feel better, right? That's self-compassion. Instead, if you're bleeding and are in a lot of pain and you keep hammering your hand over and over again, saying to yourself, "Stupid me," this seems like a ridiculous thing to do, but this is essentially what we're doing to ourselves when we're exercising self-criticism. Now, compared to your inner critic, a self-compassionate voice will say things like, "I tried my best. I'm just like everybody else, just a human being, and this is accepting the fallibility of a human. I never signed a contract to be perfect," or "I learned something. Next time we do it differently," and seeing opportunities in the mistakes or failure to grow. To take a deeper dive into understanding what self-compassion is, there are three main components that define self-compassion. First, there is self-kindness instead of self-judgment. There is also a feeling of common humanity rather than a sense of isolation. And there is mindfulness in the situation of pain rather than unawareness. Let's take a look at each of these in a little more detail. First, self-compassion has a component of mindfulness. If we were not exercising mindfulness and were unaware, we wouldn't pause to understand our own feelings and thoughts associated with failure, and we would be judging ourselves for the failure, believing in these punishing stories we tell ourselves as reality. On the other hand, with mindfulness, we stop to notice our feelings and are able to simply observe the negative stories we tell ourselves as creations of our brain. We are also able to recognize our own judgments and say to ourselves, there goes my brain again, making judgmental thoughts about myself. Now, this is like the act of self-empathy we discussed in the earlier videos, in which we broke down our judgments into feelings, like how we are feeling, and needs, what needs are not met, and what really matters. Then there is an aspect of common humanity. When we fall into the trap of self-criticism, we often feel isolated, feeling as if challenges could only happen to you, and feeling isolated from other people who live a normal, happy life. On the other hand, with common humanity, we feel connected with others and understanding that everyone fails and makes mistakes from time to time. Even though you might feel quite bad from the challenging circumstances, you know that you're not the only one, and therefore you feel accepting of your fallibility. Now, lastly, there's an aspect of kindness towards self. In the self-critical mode, we judge and use words and tones that are attacking towards the self. We get so hard on ourselves, and even though we are hurting, we tell ourselves that we need to keep going and keep finding ways to solve the problem. This is like continuing to hammer the nail into the wall even though you may be bleeding. Now, on the other hand, with kindness, our attitudes towards ourselves are caring and understanding, and we accept ourselves for the difficult experiences we are having. We recognize that we are having a difficult time and give ourselves space to pause and heal before continuing with what we wish to accomplish. So let's practice these 3 components of self-compassion to understand deeper what self-compassion is about. For this exercise, I invite you to get a pen to write with and a paper to write on. So remember the last time you had a difficult experience that you experienced pain or judged yourself or that you have felt really bad about. Let's explore first with mindfulness. This will mainly involve bringing awareness to the painful emotions that arose due to your self-judgments or difficult circumstances. Write about how you felt. Sad, ashamed, frightened, stressed, and so on. As you write, try to be accepting and non-judgmental of your experience, not belittling it nor making it overly dramatic. For example, I was frustrated because she was being so slow. I got angry, overreacted, and felt foolish afterwards. Pause the video to respond fully to the prompt before continuing. Now for common humanity. Write down the ways in which your experience was connected to the larger human experience. This might include acknowledging that being human means being imperfect and that all people have these sorts of painful experiences. Like everyone overreacts sometimes. It's only human. You might also want to think about the various causes and conditions underlying the painful event. My frustration was exacerbated by the fact that I was late for my doctor's appointment across town and there was a lot of traffic that day. If the circumstances had been different, my reaction probably would have been different. So pause the video to respond fully to the prompt before continuing. Now for self-kindness. Write yourself some kind, understanding words of comfort. Let yourself know that you care about yourself, adopting a gentle, reassuring tone. It's okay you messed up, but it wasn't the end of the world. I understand how frustrated you were and you just lost it. Maybe you can try being extra patient and generous to any waitstaff this week. Now, if you're like me, this is the part that might feel a little odd, a little uncomfortable. You might find yourself saying things like, "This is so weird. I never talk like this to myself. It feels so artificial." Now, this is because we have built a habit over time to talk differently to ourselves. Any change in our habit will be accompanied by discomfort, and it's only with practice that the extension of self-kindness is going to feel second nature to you. So pause the video to respond fully to the prompt before continuing. To further clarify what self-compassion is, I want to also distinguish the difference between self-compassion with self-pity, self-indulgence, and self-esteem. So let's start first with self-pity. Self-pity is when you become immersed in your own problems and forget that others have similar problems. It increases egocentric feelings of separation from others. On the other hand, self-compassion is when you are able to adopt a balanced and objective perspective and recognize suffering in a broader human context. For self-indulgence, it's about letting yourself get away with anything, giving pleasure at the expense of long-term well-being. So it's like, I'm stressed out, so I'm gonna let myself eat a tub of ice cream and watch TV all day. Now, on the other hand, self-compassion is about giving yourself care to provide motivating force to grow and change, accepting that certain amount of displeasure is involved in long-term wellness, without having to shame or condemn yourself. Now, with self-esteem, it refers to our sense of self-worth and perceived value or how much we like ourselves, often contingent on latest success or failure, meaning that our self-esteem fluctuates depending on ever-changing circumstances. On the other hand, with self-compassion, it's not based on self-evaluation. People give compassion for themselves because all human beings deserve compassion and understanding, not because they possess particular set of traits or because of positive outcomes. So personal feelings can be acknowledged with kindness, and self-compassion isn't dependent on external circumstances. So research shows that self-compassion practice increases emotional resilience. It increases self-concept, and it increases caring relationship behavior. It also decreases narcissism, and it decreases reactive anger. Now, out of all these items, the one that gets questioned a lot is self-compassion increasing emotional resilience. The common fear with the practice of self-compassion is, I'll be lazy and I will not be motivated to change for the better. Now, believe me, this was a doubt that I had for a long time towards self-compassion as well. Having grown up being highly critical of myself, I felt that the reason I was able to push myself to work hard despite setbacks was because I was hard on myself. The practice of self-compassion didn't sit well with me for a long time, as I felt that it was too cheesy and that it would lead me to not strive to be better. However, research shows the opposite. Research shows that self-compassion helps to cultivate a greater personal initiative to make needed changes in one's life, and research also shows that one is able to garner and rely more on intrinsic motivation rather than extrinsic motivation like social approval. So in fact, after gradually incorporating the practice of self-compassion in my life, although I still have a long way to go, the path that I take to pick myself up again after a fall looks different than before. I used to beat myself up for my inadequacies before picking myself up, and now I have become more accepting of the setbacks I face and give myself the care that I need, which often comes in the form of sleep to pick myself up again. I still have the motivation to grow and be better, but the path to get there is different, and it's a lot kinder. So self-compassion is about shifting from survival to growth rather than negatively judging and beating oneself up each time one falls. So this breeds resilience for people like Nelson Mandela, who said, "Do not judge me by my successes. Judge me by how many times I fell down and got up again." In summary, when we experience failure, many of us have a tendency to be highly critical of ourselves, which can make the path to picking ourselves up after a fall unnecessarily difficult. Instead, we can practice self-compassion, which allows us to accept the pain that we're experiencing, rest in the fact that all humans experience shortcomings from time to time, and extend care that we need to pick ourselves up. This practice doesn't make us weak. Instead, this practice yields resilience that we need to keep going as challenges will continue to show up in our life. So I'm going to wrap up by reading a poem called Pretty Ugly, in which you can notice a transition from self-criticism to self-compassion. I'm very ugly, so don't try to convince me that I'm a very beautiful person. Because at the end of the day, I hate myself in every single way. And I'm not going to lie to myself by saying there's beauty inside of me that matters. So rest assured, I will remind myself that I'm a worthless, terrible person. And nothing you say will make me believe I still deserve love. Because no matter what, I'm not good enough to be loved, and I'm in no position to believe that beauty does exist within me. Because whenever I look in the mirror, I always think, am I as ugly as people say? Now I'm going to read bottom up. Am I as ugly as people say? Because whenever I look in the mirror, I always think, beauty does exist within me. And I'm in no position to believe that I'm not good enough to be loved. Because no matter what, I still deserve love. And nothing you say will make me believe that I'm a worthless, terrible person. So rest assured, I will remind myself there's beauty inside of me that matters. And I'm not going to lie to myself by saying I hate myself in every single way. Because at the end of the day, I'm a very beautiful person. So don't try to convince me that I'm very ugly. So I hope you will engage in the practice of speaking to yourself like the second round with self-compassion. Best wishes in your practice.